The hostess didn't even look up. That was the first thing. Not the carpet, thick burgundy, the kind that swallowed sound. Not the chandelier above the lobby that threw gold light across everything like a promise. The first thing was that the hostess at the front podium of Hargrove's Steakhouse didn't look up when Calvin Mercer walked through the door. She was looking at her reservation screen, tapping something, moving things around that apparently needed moving. And Calvin stood there for a moment, just a moment, the way a man does when he's deciding whether the slight is intentional or just careless. He'd learned, across 53 years of living in this country, that the distinction mattered, not morally, but practically, because one you brush off and one you remember. He brushed it off. Reservation for Mercer, he said. 7 o'clock. The hostess, her name tag said Courtney, small gold letters on a black background, finally looked up. She took him in the way people sometimes do when they're expecting something different. Calvin was a big man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a gray tweed jacket that had seen better days and dark slacks that had not. He'd driven 4 hours from Raleigh. He hadn't changed at the rest stop outside of Richmond the way he'd told himself he would. He was tired in the specific way that long drives make you tired. Not sleepy, just worn at the edges. Courtney looked back at her screen. "I'm not seeing a Mercer. Calvin Mercer. It might be under the company, Meridian Consulting." She tapped again. The restaurant hummed behind her. Silverware, low conversation, a piano player, somewhere working through something that might have been Coltrane if you weren't paying too close attention. "I don't have anything under that either," Courtney said. Calvin put both hands in his jacket pockets. "My assistant made the reservation last Thursday. I have the confirmation number if you need it. Sir, if it's not in the system, the number is C447-88. He'd memorized it on the drive up, not because he'd expected this, just because Calvin Mercer memorized things. It was how he was built. Courtney typed it in. The silence between them had a texture to it. "I see it," she said. "But this reservation is for the private dining room, the Hargrove room." A pause. "That space is typically reserved for." "I know what it's reserved for," Calvin said. Not sharp, just even. "I'm the one who reserved it. Here is what the other people in the lobby saw, if they were paying attention. A large black man in a worn jacket standing at the hostess stand, speaking quietly to a young woman who looked increasingly uncomfortable. That was all they saw. That was, for most of them, all they needed to see. Here is what they did not see. Calvin Mercer had flown 70,000 miles last year. Calvin Mercer had testified before the Senate Commerce Committee in March on supply chain vulnerabilities. Calvin Mercer had built Meridian Consulting from a desk in his spare bedroom 22 years ago into a firm with 47 employees and clients in 11 countries. Calvin Mercer had been invited to this dinner by Thomas Weld, managing partner of Weld and Associates, one of the largest real estate development firms on the eastern seaboard, because Weld had read Calvin's most recent report on municipal infrastructure and called him personally to say it was the sharpest thinking he'd encountered in 15 years of business. None of that was visible from the lobby. None of that was on the jacket. The man who changed everything in that lobby was named Preston Holt. He was 51 years old, with silver at his temples, and the particular kind of tan you get from Hilton Head rather than from working outdoors. He was Hargrove's general manager, had been for 9 years, and he carried that tenure in the way he walked, like a man who had decided long ago that the space occupied was his to manage, his to protect, and his to dispose of if necessary. Preston Holt came out from behind the host station the way a man enters a room he owns. "Is there a problem here?" Calvin looked at him. "Just confirming my reservation." "I understand," Preston said, and the way he said it communicated that he did not. "But I want to be very clear with you about our policies here at Hargrove's." He put one hand on the podium, not touching Calvin, just establishing a perimeter. "The Hargrove room is a private space. It's not a general dining area, I know that. And the guests who use that room are typically what?" Calvin asked. Preston's jaw moved slightly. He chose a different word than the one he'd started toward. "Known to us," he finished, "regular guests. Clients of long standing. Thomas Weld made this reservation," Calvin said. "If you want to call him, I'm happy to wait." Something moved through Preston Holt's face. Thomas Weld was not a name you dismissed at Hargrove's. Thomas Weld's company had hosted 17 events in that back room over the past 6 years. Thomas Weld's account was on the preferred client list. But Thomas Weld was not standing in this lobby. Thomas Weld was, presumably, somewhere else, expected to arrive later, and in the meantime there was this man, this tired, worn-jacketed man, claiming to have been sent ahead. "I'm going to need to verify that," Preston said. "That's fine," Calvin said. "Verify it." The bar at Hargrove's was separated from the main lobby by a half wall of frosted glass, and the man sitting at the far end of it had been watching this exchange with the quiet focus of someone who had learned to read rooms the way other people read faces. His name was Roland Gibbs. He was 61 years old, recently retired after 34 years as a federal judge in the Fourth Circuit. And he was in Richmond this evening because his granddaughter was being baptized tomorrow morning at First Baptist on Monument Avenue. He'd arrived early. Roland was always early and had settled at the bar with a bourbon and a comfortable silence. Roland Gibbs watched Preston Holt position himself between Calvin Mercer and the hostess stand, and he set down his glass. He'd seen this before. Not exactly this, but the shape of it, the architecture of it, the way one person's authority, real or assumed, got pressed against another person's presence like a hand against a door. Roland picked his glass back up, set it down again, looked at the bar top. He was retired. This was not his courtroom. He was here for his granddaughter. He did not move. Preston Holt made a phone call in the small office behind the host station. He was on for 4 minutes. When he came back out, something in his posture had shifted, not to something better, but to something more settled, more certain of itself. "Mr. Weld's office confirmed the reservation," he said. "However, they indicated that the guest list for this evening's dinner had not been finalized." He paused to let that land. "We do have availability in our main dining room. I'd be happy to seat you there while we sort this out." Calvin looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Weld's office," he repeated. "That's correct, his office, which is closed because it's 7:15 on a Thursday evening." Preston's chin lifted very slightly. "We have an after-hours contact. Who told you the guest list wasn't finalized?" "That's what I was told, yes." Calvin breathed in slowly through his nose. He'd been doing this for 30 years, navigating rooms that didn't want him, people who'd decided before he opened his mouth what kind of man he was. He had a system. Keep the voice low. Keep the body still. Don't give them the reaction they're expecting, because the reaction is what they'll use to justify everything that comes next. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Weld directly," Calvin said. "I don't have that number." "I do." Calvin reached into his jacket pocket. What happened next happened fast. A man appeared at Calvin's elbow, one of Hargrove's security staff, broad and young with a radio clipped to his belt. Calvin hadn't seen him approach. Preston hadn't visibly signaled him, but there he was, and the message of his presence was unambiguous. "Sir," the security man said, "if you'd like to continue this conversation, we can move it outside." "I'm making a phone call," Calvin said. "Sir, I am standing in a restaurant where I have a confirmed reservation, and I am making a phone call to the man who invited me here." Calvin's voice had not changed volume, had not changed register. It was the most controlled thing in the room. "I'd appreciate if you'd let me do that." The lobby was quiet now. Not completely. The piano was still playing, silverware still moved somewhere, but the people nearest to this scene had stopped pretending to be interested in other things. A woman at a table just past the half wall of frosted glass put her hand over her daughter's. A man near the elevator cleared his throat. Nobody said anything. At the bar, Roland Gibbs watched the security guard put a hand on Calvin Mercer's forearm. Not a grab, a placement. The kind of touch that communicates ownership. Roland set down his bourbon. He was 61 years old. His knees ached when it rained. He had told himself when he retired that he was done. Done with the weight of it. Done with carrying other people's injustice in his chest. His daughter had told him, "Daddy, you've given enough. You are allowed to just exist now." He stood up from the bar stool. "Take your hand off him." The voice came from Roland Gibbs's direction, and it filled the lobby the way a voice fills a courtroom. Not loud, but absolute. The kind of voice that had ended careers and changed lives by adjusting its temperature 1 degree. The security guard turned. Preston Holt turned. Courtney behind the podium turned. Roland Gibbs walked across the lobby with the unhurried certainty of a man who had spent 3 decades deciding what was right and what was not. "This man has a confirmed reservation," Roland said. "He has told you that. He has offered you a confirmation number. He has offered to contact the host of this dinner directly." Roland stopped 6 feet from Preston Holt and looked at him with the patience of someone who had heard every excuse and catalogued every evasion. "What exactly is the problem?" Preston Holt straightened. "Sir, this is a private matter between—" "I've been sitting at that bar for 40 minutes, Roland said. "I've watched this entire exchange. I'm going to tell you what I've seen." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I've seen a man treated as though his presence here is an error that needs correcting. I've seen that same man respond with more patience and dignity than I would have managed, and I've seen you make phone calls to phantom offices to manufacture reasons to make him feel unwelcome in a place he has every right to be." Roland paused. "Now, are you going to seat this man, or are we going to continue this conversation in a way that becomes considerably more inconvenient for you?" Here is what Preston Holt did not know, because nothing about Roland Gibbs's gray pants and off-the-rack blazer suggested it. Roland Gibbs had been appointed to the federal bench by a sitting president. Roland Gibbs had written 3 opinions that had been cited by the Supreme Court. Roland Gibbs was, at this exact moment, 4 months from being named to a federal oversight panel, reviewing practices of discrimination in commercial establishments. Roland Gibbs also happened to have his old bench credentials in his billfold. He carried them still, not for show, but because after 34 years some habits don't shed, and those credentials had a way of reorienting a conversation very quickly. But he didn't show them yet, because he'd learned, over a very long career, that sometimes you let people choose correctly before you show them why correct was the only option. "Mr. Weld," Preston said, and his voice had changed now. Something careful had entered it. "If you'd just let me call." "His name," Roland said, "is Calvin Mercer. And you've made him stand in this lobby for 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Roland had been counting. Because that's the kind of man Roland Gibbs was. The phone in Preston Holt's pocket buzzed. He looked at it, and whatever he saw on the screen made the color in his face do something complicated. He excused himself with a gesture that wasn't quite an apology and stepped toward the office. Calvin stood in the lobby and breathed. Roland Gibbs walked over to him, not with the big energy of a man who'd just performed something, but with the quiet of one who understood exactly what had happened and didn't need it acknowledged. "Roland Gibbs," he said, and extended his hand. Calvin took it. "Calvin Mercer." "I know," Roland said. "I've read your infrastructure work, the piece in the Georgetown Policy Review last spring." Calvin looked at him. "You read that?" "Twice," Roland said. "The section on municipal water systems and bond rating dependencies. That's going to matter in about 18 months, when 3 mid-sized cities hit the wall you predicted." He tilted his head. "You want a drink while we wait for this gentleman to remember his manners?" Preston Holt emerged from the office 3 minutes later. He had the look of a man who had just had a longer conversation than he'd planned with someone considerably more important than he'd expected. Thomas Weld had, in fact, been reached. Thomas Weld had not been pleased. Thomas Weld had said 4 sentences and then ended the call, and every syllable of those 4 sentences was still rearranging something in Preston Holt's chest. He walked toward Calvin Mercer with his hands at his sides, and his face adjusted to something that was working very hard to resemble contrition. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "the Hargrove room is ready for you. I apologize for any inconvenience." Inconvenience. Calvin looked at him, held the look for exactly as long as it took Preston Holt to understand that the word had not been adequate. Then Calvin nodded, once briefly, and let it go. Not because it was over, not because it was fine, but because Calvin Mercer had learned the difference between battles that needed to be finished in the room and battles that needed to be finished somewhere else, in writing, with documentation, with the full weight of time and record behind them. He had been making notes on his phone since the security guard touched his arm. The Hargrove room was beautiful. Dark wood paneling, candles, a long table set for 12. Thomas Weld was already there, and he stood when Calvin entered and crossed the room to shake his hand with both of his and said, "Calvin, I am so sorry, I just heard." "It's handled," Calvin said. "It is not handled," Thomas Weld said. He was 64, white-haired, the kind of man who had spent his life in rooms where everything was handled and knew exactly what that phrase meant and what it hid. "I've known Harold Hargrove for 20 years. This will not stand." Calvin sat down. The chair was comfortable. The candles threw warm light across the table. "I'd like to eat first," Calvin said. "If that's all right." Thomas Weld laughed, a short, surprised laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, let's eat." Roland Gibbs did not join the dinner. He wasn't invited, and he hadn't expected to be. He finished his bourbon at the bar and settled his tab and put on his coat and walked toward the door. Courtney, the hostess, watched him pass. She'd been watching him since he'd stood up from the bar stool. She was 24 years old and had been working at Hargrove's for 14 months, and had watched Preston Holt run the front of house with a particular kind of authority she'd always told herself was just professionalism. She had stood at that podium and not looked up when Calvin Mercer walked in, and she had not done it to be cruel, and she had done it without thinking, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she was starting to understand what that meant. Roland Gibbs stopped at the podium on his way out. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't deliver a lesson. He was 61 years old, and his granddaughter was being baptized tomorrow, and he was tired. He said, "Long night?" Courtney said, "Yes, sir." Roland nodded, like that was the right answer, and walked out into the Richmond evening. What happened after is worth knowing. Calvin Mercer had dinner with Thomas Weld and 9 other people who'd come from Philadelphia and D.C., and Charlotte to hear him speak for 40 minutes about what was wrong with the way American cities finance their infrastructure and what might, if people were willing to listen, be done about it. He spoke without notes. He answered questions for another hour. 3 of the people in that room commissioned work from Meridian Consulting before they left the building. The notes Calvin had made on his phone during those 23 minutes in the lobby became the foundation of a formal complaint filed with the Virginia Human Rights Council 6 days later. The complaint was thorough and specific and referenced the exact language used by Preston Holt and the exact duration of each exchange. It named the restaurant, the manager, and the establishment's pattern of practice. Harold Hargrove, who had owned this restaurant for 31 years and was not a man who liked being in the news for the wrong reasons, called Calvin personally. That conversation lasted 40 minutes. What came out of it? New hiring practices, mandatory staff training, a revised approach to reservation management, was not nothing. Preston Holt left Hargrove's 2 months later. The restaurant's official statement described it as a mutual decision. Preston's version of events, told to anyone who would listen, was more complicated. The truth, as truths tend to be, was somewhere in the space between the version people perform and the version they carry home. Roland Gibbs was asked about it later, much later, when it had become a story people told in the context of other stories, and someone asked him why he'd stood up. Why that moment? Why that particular act of intervention from a man who'd spent 34 years adjudicating other people's conflicts and had earned every right to sit on a bar stool and let the world handle itself? Roland thought about it for a moment. He said, "I've watched people be quiet in rooms their whole lives because they decided the fight wasn't theirs. And I've watched what happens to the people left alone in the middle of those rooms." He paused. A man was standing there being told that his presence was the problem. I've spent my whole career in rooms where that happens, and the thing that makes it keep happening, the actual engine of it, isn't the Preston Holts of the world. They're just doing what they've always been allowed to do. Another pause. It's everyone else at the bar. He looked at the person asking. "I've been everyone else at the bar," Roland said. "I know exactly what that costs." Calvin Mercer drove back to Raleigh the next morning. He stopped at the same rest stop outside of Richmond, the one he'd meant to stop at on the way up. He got coffee from the vending machine, the kind that comes out lukewarm and slightly too sweet, and he sat at a picnic table in the early November cold, and he didn't do anything in particular for about 15 minutes. He thought about his mother, who had worked the front desk of a hotel in Greensboro for 22 years, and had told him, when he was 11 years old, that the way you walk into a room matters, because the room is always making a decision about you before you open your mouth, and your job is to make that decision harder to make wrong. He had carried that with him for 42 years, through offices and boardrooms and Senate chambers, and last night through a lobby in Richmond. He thought about Roland Gibbs, whom he'd looked up on his phone between the appetizer and the entree. 4th Circuit, 34 years, 3 Supreme Court citations, came out of retirement for 60 seconds to say, "Take your hand off him." Some things, Calvin thought, you can't plan for. Some people just show up. He finished the coffee. He threw the cup away. He got back in the car and drove south on 85 toward home, past tobacco fields and water towers, and the particular flatness of eastern Carolina that had always felt, to him, like something honest, like a landscape that wasn't pretending to be anything it wasn't. The quietest revolution is the one fought by the man who doesn't raise his voice, who makes his notes, who files his complaint, who comes back the next morning and does the work. It doesn't make the news. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't end in a dramatic moment that anyone witnesses. But it compounds, slowly the way all real things do. Calvin Mercer drove home.